Welcome, this is Bold Like a Leopard, and we are going to get you the topic right away. But before we start, please like this video and subscribe, and we're getting right into the topic now. So, a lot of people will ask a libertarian or a non interventionist, even if they're not a libertarian, what exactly would it take to provoke you to support a military intervention overseas? And for me, it's not exactly uh, an easy proposition to describe, but I think a couple of things would come to mind. First of all, you would see an open aggression over international borders without provocation, such as an invasion of one country by another. The other issue, of course, would be a blatant attack on a U.S. Ship or other U.S. Holding overseas, such as an embassy or, for example, attacks on some of our dignitaries overseas, murdered tourists, things like that. Those would those would, in my mind, justify an intervention, but it doesn't necessarily define the size of the intervention. In some cases, surgical operations are better, but I definitely do not think that a country melting down into uh, basically economic chaos would necessitate a full intervention, not by the United States at least. So I've covered Venezuela extensively on this channel, not, I repeat, not because it is a case of socialism falling apart in a country. I think that that's part of the problem. Okay, and I'm not going to pretend that there's any way to excuse what's going on in Venezuela by saying it's not socialism, but to illustrate how total concentration of control of political and economic power in the hands of a few people can lead to economic ruin. And that can manifest itself in either a socialist regime or, in some cases, in a traditionalist regime, as it did in Spain for many years, especially in the 50s through the 70s. So, Venezuela, just for a quick update before I get to the real issues at hand, is really there is no path forward. Okay, it says here this is actually from a couple hours ago. Venezuela's PDVSA is in default. Says the total debt fell in 2018. It said that its debt fell by 5% in 2018 from a year ago to $34.6 billion, though it remains in default on most of its bonds as crude output has slumped to 70 years low in an economic crisis. So, to be clear, that means that the oil output in Venezuela is actually lower than it was not only when PDVSA was formed in the mid 1970s, but I guess it would be now almost 30 years earlier than that, back in the 1940s. So if you think about it this way, the oil output here is the oil output there, sorry, is lower than it has been since the end of World War II. That's how bad it is. PDVSA, which is short for Petróleos de Venezuela, has not paid interest on most of its bonds since the end of 2017, and together with Venezuela's government, has accumulated nearly $8 billion in late interest payments. It has remained current on its 2020 bond, whose collateral is its U.S. oil refining subsidiary, Citgo. So at this point, to kind of simplify what's going on here, in general, they're not paying down their bonds from previous years, which is a problem. It's a problem because they're going to be subject to a lot of litigation from some of those bondholders, their creditors. What they're doing is they're prioritizing certain bonds that upon which are dependent their holdings in their major subsidiary Citgo, which is here in the U.S. and is going through a lot of legal trouble of its own. And we've done videos on this channel before covering that issue as well. Venezuela blames U.S. sanctions for the payment problems, but critics of the socialist government say President Nicolás Maduro's management of the economy and the OPEC nations' oil reserves are the root of the country's financial crisis. PDVSA's announcement in the form of an advisory in a local newspaper said it owed $24.7 billion to bondholders, down from $25.1 billion in 2017. Two subsidiaries were accounted for most of the decline: PDVSA Holding, which owns Citgo, and the Venezuelan Petroleum Corporation, which manages PDVSA's joint ventures with foreign companies. Okay? While U.S. sanctions bar holders of PDVSA and Venezuela bonds from negotiating a possible debt restructuring, some investors are moving toward legal action to get the two parties to pay. Last month, a group of creditors demanded Venezuela make $1.5 billion in payments on its 2034 bond. So I think that if there were no sanctions, Venezuela would probably still be spiraling into an abyss. So I don't think that sanctions are necessary. I think that in reality, they sort of give a how should I call it? They give a moral out to the regime of Nicolás Maduro, which doesn't deserve it. Maduro's regime, just like other governments around the world, so I'm not singling out Venezuela, they muzzle the press, they detain people without trial, they've basically usurped the control of the country's legal system by packing the Supreme Court, and they've made the National Assembly impotent, so the legislative body has virtually no power. So lately there has been a military uprising here. This is from Te Trece, which is from Chile, and they actually show some of the video from the uprising.
Señores, aquí está la Guardia Nacional. Miren, lo que ustedes quieren.
So he's saying, I guess, gentlemen, we are here from the National Guard.
Pueblo de Venezuela, aquí está unida para restablecer el hilo constitucional.
So they're saying we're here in order to restore the constitutional order.
Ustedes querían esto, nosotros también.
Cuesta creer que quienes hablan lleven armas y uniformes.
So the presenter is noting that they're wearing uniforms and bearing weapons.
Aquí estoy con mis guerreros, guardias nacionales, que no van a decaer. Les pido por favor a aquellos guerreros también de la calle que salgan a protestar, a manifestar.
So in that clip, this sergeant, who his name I think is in the next article, but in either case, he's calling for the people and for other military personnel to go out into the street and demonstrate against the Maduro government. And this is from the Jamaica Daily Gleaner, which is, they're covering this. That uprising was put down. So these National Guard soldiers have been arrested already. You can see this is a photo of a lady protesting against Maduro. So Venezuela's government said Monday it put down a mutiny by a National Guard unit in a poor neighborhood a few miles from Venezuela's presidential palace. The uprising triggered protests in the same neighborhood that were dispersed with tear gas. The armed forces, in a statement, said that it had captured all those involved in what it described as a treasonous act motivated by obscure interests tied to the far right. It said at around 2:50 a.m., a small group of guardsmen took captive a captain in charge of a police station in western Caracas, and then moved across the capital in two military trucks to the poor neighborhood of Petare, where they stole a cache of weapons from another outpost. They met resistance and were caught hours later at a National Guard outpost 2 miles from the Miraflores presidential palace. So they got to about 2 miles. That's not necessarily great progress for people trying to pull off a coup. Not that I'm trying to give people advice, but it just isn't good progress. The armed forces said all the weapons had been recovered and the mutinous troops captured. A few hours later, a group of heavily armed National Guardsmen published a series of videos on social media saying they won't recognize President Nicolás Maduro's government, which has come under increasing domestic and international pressure over a newly launched second term that the opposition-controlled Congress and many nations consider illegitimate. So here is Vice President Pence making this statement on Venezuela.
Hola, I'm Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. And on behalf of President Donald Trump and all the American people, let me express the unwavering support of the United States as you, the people of Venezuela, raise your voices in a call for freedom. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. He's never won the presidency in a free and fair election, and he's maintained his grip of power by imprisoning anyone who dares to oppose him. The United States joins with all freedom-loving nations in recognizing the National Assembly as the last vestige of democracy in your country, for it's the only body elected by you, the people. As such, the United States supports the courageous decision by Juan Guaidó, the President of your National Assembly, to assert that body's constitutional powers, declare Maduro a usurper, and call for the establishment of a transitional government. As you make your voices heard tomorrow, on behalf of the American people, we say to all the good people of Venezuela, estamos con ustedes. We are with you. We stand with you. And we will stay with you until democracy is restored and you reclaim your birthright of libertad. Muchas gracias y vayan con Dios.
Okay, well, my reaction to Vice President Pence is shut up. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't care, by the way, if you guys are MAGA supporters out there watching this, because this is wrong. I don't care what administration does it. So the reason that I oppose U.S. intervention in Venezuela, which he didn't explicitly say was in the offing, but which he is hinting at, is that in our history with Latin America, the U.S. has consistently gone in and intervened in their internal affairs. And that's one of the main reasons that Latin America continues to be kind of a backwater that doesn't reach its full potential. And what do you think happens because of that? We end up getting a lot of migrants coming up here to the USA and trying to reach their economic goals here as opposed to in their own countries, right? So this is one of the reasons we have immigration issues in the U.S. is because we can't go and leave well enough alone in these other countries. We don't have to necessarily support countries whose governments we have philosophical differences with, which would include Venezuela. But look at all of these countries where we had these interventions back in the early 19th, I guess the late 19th century and the early 20th century. You have Nicaragua in the in the teens. Also, by the way, we had Marines in Nicaragua during the 20s. For those of you that don't know, that's how Sandino actually came about. That's why there was Sandinistas, because Augusto Sandino was an opponent of U.S. intervention in Nicaragua in the 20s. That's how far back it goes over there. We actually occupied Cuba after the Spanish-American War, which a lot of Americans don't even learn about. The only thing we usually learn about as far as the Spanish-American War is that Teddy Roosevelt was in it and the Maine blew up. But we ended up taking over Cuba for about 20 years, as well as Puerto Rico. That's why Puerto Rico is a part of our country. And that's one of the reasons I think that, unfortunately, it still is. I think Puerto Rico should probably get its independence. Okay, that's just my opinion. We've had U.S. troops in Haiti several times. I think most recently we put troops there in the early 90s under President Clinton. In the Dominican Republic, I think in the 60s, we actually had U.S. troops deployed there after the assassination of President Trujillo. And we've had all sorts of interventions in the country of Colombia down here, this big red block over here, especially during the drug war. Don't forget Operation Just Cause in 1989 against Panama, led by the recently departed President Bush, the elder. And of course, we can't forget about Grenada, which is somewhere in this area over here, which we invaded in the 80s because of supposed Cuban control over there. and then we have our relationship with Cuba. Now, I want you guys to just be receptive of this. I'm not trying to support the regime of Nicolas Maduro. I think he's a horrible person, and I've spent a lot of my time on this channel and writing to talk about the reasons why Venezuela is in such awful shape. So you might be asking, now that you're sitting in your chair there, and I've said I don't want intervention, I don't want any sort of U.S. involvement there. Well, then, Ramon, what do you propose we do at all? My proposition is that we pretty much we get behind and support their neighbors opposing Maduro. Okay, Venezuela's neighbors could easily mount a land invasion of the country from the south and the west in order to depose Maduro. And in fact, they have a territorial dispute with Guyana currently that could lead to that. I don't think that Venezuela's army would necessarily die in order to. I don't think his soldiers would die in order to save his regime, given that he's led to misery all throughout the country. So again, I would say to President Pence, shut up. This is the wrong thing to do. You're repeating the mistakes of the past. In fact, back in the 30s, President Roosevelt, this is one of the better ideas that he had. You know, I know a lot of people who are on the right criticize him, but he started the good neighbor policy, which I don't think the U.S. has been faithful to, where we don't invade these countries in Latin America. By the way, that's called the Banana Wars. All of our interventions in Latin America for our economic interests, that was a policy that has led the region in part. It's not all of our fault, but it is somewhat our fault. It's led those countries to be economically destitute, dependent on foreign investment, and basically beholden to our hegemony. So I oppose all those policies, and I would hope we would get an administration that would oppose it as well. And if it's not going to be the Trump administration, I think that we have to figure out exactly who the next candidate would be, who would oppose these wars in Latin America, who would oppose these interventions. I don't think the Democrats necessarily would offer a candidate apart from Tulsi Gabbard who would commit to non-intervention in Latin America. But President Trump would be making a huge mistake here, and we shouldn't let him get away with it, because it doesn't matter if our troops are intervening in the Middle East, which I spoke to Alex about yesterday in our debate, or in Latin America. When we put our troops on the line in order to pursue certain interests that are not necessarily in defense against overt aggression, that sends the wrong message to the rest of the world. That sends the message that we're the world police, and that's one of the reasons that people voted for Trump, because they disagreed with that attitude. So that's about it. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to my second channel, Razor Ray Special Cuts, and my channels on Cocoscope and on BitChute. You can find all my other social media right here behind me. And have a great night.